Well, good evening, everyone. It is good to be back with you again. We are now going to be focusing on part 2 of our study and discussion on social media and its influence upon us as individuals, but specifically on young people, on teenagers. So today, this evening, we're going to be looking at the following topics. We're going to begin by discussing appropriate modeling behavior. We're going to look at ways that we can recognize influence. We're going to look at the problem of pornography and how do parents handle the variety of issues that will come up to them. And then we'll look at several of the questions that were submitted. So when we look at the subject of modeling behavior, one question that will come up is, if you were to ask your child the question, what is the most important thing to me? So as a parent, if you go to your child and say, what's the most important thing to me? What do you think that they would say? And when you think about it, and perhaps you could even ask your child this, maybe not right now, perhaps, but you might be surprised in a good way, or you might be disappointed. When we look at the responsibility of parents with respect to children, we need to model the appropriate behavior. And the first step is that we must prioritize serving God, number one in our life. When our children look at us and look at our behavior and look at what is important to us, they can tell exactly what's important to us. Like we can say, oh, God's most important, or but if our behavior doesn't reflect that, then our children can detect that hypocrisy. So we need to prioritize on a personal level serving God, and that will model the appropriate behavior for our children. The second is that we need, as the second most important thing, is to serve others. So when our children look at us, do they see us modeling selflessness, or do they see us modeling self-centered selfishness? When they see us, for instance, when it comes to technology, like, am I too busy? Am I focused more on my phone? Am I focused more on me than I am on others? And these 2 points really are just drawn directly out of Matthew chapter 22, which is, when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he said that you should love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is likened unto it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And that's exactly the behavior that we should model. Now, this groundwork here, you'll see as we look at what comes after that is when we look at and examine what are we doing with respect to entertainment? What are we doing with respect to recreation? What are we doing with respect to, our phone? Like, is our phone really in last place, or is our phone more important? Do we model like it's hard for us to put our phone down? It's hard for us to carry on a conversation because I'm too busy. I need to check the email. I need to look at the social media feed, whatever it may be. And so we need to make sure that we're modeling that behavior. So when we look at, for instance, our phone usage, and this also applies to teens just as much as it applies to parents, but when we look at our phone usage, when are we using it and how are we using it, right? Are we using the phone during limited family times? I know that we, in our society today, we have very busy lives. People are going off to work and going off to school. Then there's after school activities, there's sports, there's all manner of things that are taking the time. And so when there is that time to spend together as a family, is that downtime spent, I'm going to be looking at my phone. I'm going to, I'm checking on the sports scores. I'm looking at my Facebook feed. I'm doing something along those lines, right? Am I doing that during that limited family time, or am I building and strengthening the bond of the family? sometimes the phone can be so addictive, we don't even realize that it's so addictive, that that instead of bonding and strengthening and building that bond with our families, that we end up just living in the same house with our kids and our spouse, and we're focused on ourselves. There was ironically, on social media, I saw a meme, and it was like a cartoon depiction of a couple who were they were lying in bed, and they had their backs to each other, and they were facing away from each other, and they each had a phone in their hand, and they were looking at the phone. And so when you think about that, does that describe the situation that you may find yourself in? And if so, like that, there's an example. That's a time when, there's alone time with a husband and wife, and the kids, the troubles of the world, those things are away, where they can discuss situations of the family and spend that time bonding, as opposed to being focused or distracted on social media, as that just continues to draw our attention and its addictive nature. And then I think that we need to make sure that we realize just how much social media and technology use influences our daily life. So I want to do a little exercise. How much time, when you think about this, I want you to keep a running total, right? So this will be a little math test for us. I want you to keep a running total. So how much time do you spend? This is for mostly for the teens, but it could be for the parents as well. Right. So how much time do you spend daily in school? How many hours? And then perhaps add to that how much time you spend doing sports or hanging out with your friends after school. Perhaps you have a part-time job on a regular basis. How many hours do you work there? Then how much time do you spend on your phone, playing on social media and looking at social media feeds and videos and whatnot? And then now you've gone through that list. Now compare that number with how much time you actually spend with quality family time. I'm not talking about at the house, just being at the house. I'm talking about quality interacting family time, you with your parents or your siblings, or you there with your family. And think about how much time that you would spend, for instance, at church, there at Bible study or at worship, right? And compare those to each other. Like, well, there's only 168 hours in a week, right? And we spend, let's assume that, you get a reasonable amount of rest. You get 56 hours of sleeping. And then, you spend, 35 hours at school. How much time do you spend at sports, and how much time do you spend at work? So when you think about this, right? So one of the questions that a parent asked was, how do we effectively combat the negative messages that kids see on social media? And is the answer just to restrict them from using it? And when you look at what we need to focus on as parents and as teens, when we're looking at technology, what the things that we consume, right? Whatever we fill ourselves, whatever we fill our hearts and minds with, that's going to have a significant influence upon us. And so if the only time that we discuss anything of a religious nature or about righteousness is at church, and so you get a whole 4 hours a week, and the other 164 hours are spent on you, right? We look and say, why are teens falling away, right? Well, if the only instruction that they're receiving is 4 hours a day, like, are we studying with our children at home and studying the Bible? Like, it's perfectly fine. Bring up your phone, pull up the Bible app on your phone, right? But are we discussing the Bible and studying the Bible at home Bible studies, right? Are we fulfilling Deuteronomy 6? Are we talking about God and his ways when we sit down, when we walk around, when we lie down, when we rise up? And so if we think we're going to combat 130 hours of worldliness with 4.5 hours, 6 hours of perhaps righteousness, I think that we we fool ourselves where the influence is at, right? If we have focus and the importance that are all on school and sports and work and all these things, and then we don't put the focus where it needs to be, right? That influence, Satan is going to take advantage of whatever avenues are provided. And if we use whatever free time, right? And I use that loosely, whatever free time that we have all on social media, consuming more worldliness, it's going to certainly have a negative impact upon us. We talked last week about social media algorithms and them and how they're designed to serve you as a consumer, right? So you are a consumer in that respect, but you are the product, but they're going to serve you exactly what you're vulnerable to in order to keep you on there as long as you possibly can. So if I were there in person, I would have handed out pieces of paper with some pencil, and I would say, okay, I want you to write this down. And so, so maybe if you have your phone, here's a little technology, you can type it as a note to yourself on your phone, or you can write it down. But I want to ask you a question. What are you vulnerable to? And I want you to think about, and this is for adults too. So I want you to think about, what are you vulnerable to? And be honest with yourself and write it down, right? Make a note, because like when you think about where your weakness is, what you're vulnerable to, then when you think about that, look at your usage online, right? Is that an area that you seek out? Are you seeking out the very area that you're weak in? Or perhaps maybe, do you recognize that that's a weakness? And what are you doing to protect yourself? Right. So you may say, well, I know this is an area of weakness, so I'm not going to go and seek that out. Well, that's good. But what are you doing, right? How do you handle that? How do you handle when you do come across that? How do you handle when you're faced with it? What steps do you take, right? Or, well, when I stumble across it, well, then I'm drawn in. I'm drawn into, and it could be things like, like I see political discussions on Facebook, and I mean, it's like a moth to the flame. Some people cannot avoid it. You lay that little bit of bait out there and people lose their minds. So what are you vulnerable to? And then, like, I'd like to ask, so for the teens, and it could be for the adults, what are your friends that you go to school with? What are they vulnerable to? Or do you know what things, what topics, what types of things they're vulnerable to that they have a hard time getting away from when they're online, when they're looking, where there are areas of weakness? What about your brethren? Like, we have a responsibility to our brother. Cain asked the question, am I my brother's keeper? And he asked that in a rhetorical fashion, but we are our brother's keeper. So where are your brethren vulnerable? And how do you hold yourself accountable? Because one of the things that is different about social media is, in years past, if you were to be engaged in illicit activity, you had to go somewhere, this one location, this bad place, whatever it may be, right? Now we have access to it on our phone. It's right here, anytime, 24 hours a day, it's here. So if we know what we're vulnerable to, how do we hold ourselves accountable? And sometimes the initial response is I'm just going to hide it, right? Like, and then my mind is brought back to Achan, who, if we recall, when Jericho was destroyed, he was told not to take of any of the items, and he took of some of those things and he buried them in his tent and he hid them. And because of that, Israel as a nation, when they went to battle the very next time to Ai, if I remember correctly, they lost that battle. And they lost that battle because of his sin influenced others. Sometimes we think, well, my sin, it only impacts me, or it doesn't hurt anybody else. And that's not the case at all. So Aiken, it was a very real, you could see it, but that's the case with us as well. And so what are we vulnerable to? And one of the things that we did not talk about last week in social media, because we were really looking at more of the algorithm and looking at more its general influence, but one of the key areas that draws people in and holds people is pornography. And there are some statistics here that I saw that I think might be interesting and maybe even startling to some of you. We talked last week about the difference between a so-called good kid and a bad kid, and really it's what they're exposed to and what they engage in is really your behavior is what determines that classification, so to speak, if you will. And when we think about the mentality, sometimes parents are like, not my kid. I've got a good kid. My kid would never fill in the blank, right? My child would never. I know my child. And so this statistic here, I included this on purpose. So there was a recent report by this was a 2020 report by, this is a British board that did this study, and 75% of parents believe that their child had never encountered porn, right, of this specific study. So 75% of parents believe their child had never encountered porn, but of those children, 53% reported that they had in fact seen porn. So 75% said, oh no, my child, they hadn't seen, 53% had seen it. The parents were unaware. Now, whether that's because they were oblivious to the fact, they were in denial, because their kid hid it well, like there's a whole host of reasons, but it's a real problem. It is pervasive in our world. It is absolutely, and we're going to look at some other statistics here in just a second. Another one is, according to research by yet another group here, of the adolescents who were exposed to pornography, 28% said their first exposure to porn was by accident. 19% said that someone unexpectedly showed them, like, hey, look at this, right? And only 19% searched for it intentionally. So of these kids, you have 28, and then you have 19, you have these kids that are surprised and it's sprung on them, and they're not out there looking for it. And this is likely what's happening to our children if they're, or when they are, as opposed to if, when they are exposed to pornography. The last statistic, and then I'll show you a couple charts here. Despite the fact, that porn is this distorted, it just amplifies the worst of the worst, right? Over 53% of boys and 39% of girls stated in a study that they believed that pornography was a realistic depiction of what sex was like. And if they're learning about God's designed gift between a husband and a wife, and they're learning about it from the worst places in the world, right? And this is their, like, we have work to do as parents. Like, it's frightening. Here's an interesting chart about the frequency in which teens 12 to 17 come across porn. So 8% of them say, yeah, I come across it every day, right? 21% every week. And so you can see the chart there. And then of those that seek it out, so 50% of teens come across pornography monthly or more often, at least monthly or more, 50% of teens. Now, do you think that those children that, the parents that are sitting here, do you think that your children are exempt from this accidental coming across exposure here? That 50% is only of the world, and that your children are entirely, like, if you look statistically, half of the teens of that youth group have been exposed to pornography in the last month. That should make us go, oh. And the number gets worse for young adults, right? And the problem when you look at, and this is and I can share these links to where this research came from, and this study is from about 5 years ago. But I think the problem only gets worse because it's just more and more available, and it's pressed more because the longer that you look, the more that you're on there, the more money that they make. And it's not this is not just a problem, right? So sometimes pornography is viewed like just as a problem for boys, right, or men. And the statistics that I come across are that 75% of men, right, and 30% of women have instances of the porn users, right? So that they have consumed. This is porn consumption rates among young adults, and the number was 75%. So 50% coming across it monthly or more often. Another study says 75%. Now, I don't know exactly which one, and we're not dialing it in for sure, but the point is this is a real problem. And it's not just a problem for boys. It's not just a problem for men. It exists, and it's a problem for women as well. Now, here's where the influence. So we looked at and we talked about influence a little earlier. Now, this chart, this is, I don't even know how to describe this. Like, this is startling. So what they did is they asked these teens, they asked the question, they said, please tell us, we want you to tell us yes or no, always wrong, sometimes wrong, whatever, actions that are always wrong or that are usually wrong. Okay, so the number one item out of the whole list, taking something that belongs, stealing, right? 88% said stealing is always or usually wrong, right? And then adultery is number 2, lying is number 3, right? Look at number 4. Number 4 is not recycling. Now, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't recycle, right? But not recycling is number 4. 5 is thinking negatively about someone with a different point of view. So there is the focus on tolerance, irrespective of truth. That's the message that's being sent out, and that's reflected here in number 5, right? And then overeating is number 6. Significant consumption, like, so you see what these things are. Look at what number 9 is. Number 9, only 32% said viewing pornography was wrong, usually or always wrong. 27% said reading erotic or pornographic content without any pictures, 27%, right? More of them thought that not recycling was worse than viewing porn, watching explicit pornography, reading pornographic content. Like, it is. So when you think about that influence, so this one didn't ask the question, but I would ask the question to the teens, right? So as you're thinking about this, right, if you were asked that question, well, of course, we know, oh, they would be wrong. It'd be 100% across the board for this group, right? Okay, so how do you view porn? All right, well, this is how we view. How do you view LGBT issues? How do you view, like, fill in the blank of whatever the issue is that's pressing? Why do you believe the way you believe? Why do you feel the way that you feel, right? Is the view that you hold, is that a biblical view or is that a worldly viewpoint? Like, what is, and as you consume content, like those kids didn't think recycling was number 4. 56% of them say it's usually or always wrong to not recycle. They didn't get that by accident. That's not inherent, right? That was because they've consumed that material, right? They've been told that and they see that. Now that's at school and what's going on there. But the question that we need to look at for ourselves is, are my views on any range of subjects, is it the biblical view? And I would ask, where do you suppose that this skewing of the numbers, this influence is coming from? And I think the answer is pretty easy. I think it's social media, and that social media is nothing more than an amplification of what the world around them is doing, right? So the world at a public school is just a microcosm, if you will, of that's what, when you look at social media, that's what you're getting. You're just getting an amplification of that, and oftentimes it's the worst of the worst. And pornography sometimes is really viewed from a parent's perspective of things like, okay, that's a site that you would go to and you would see these things, but it's much more, right? So you have sexting, which is not the easiest thing to think about, but 15% of teens reported they had sent a sexually explicit text message. and 27% have received one. So that 27%, so that 27% who had received one, right? Do you think that that might mean that 27%, or okay, let's cut it in half, right? So let's say that 13 or 14% of the teens there at university, do you think that perhaps they might have received one? There were other statistics that said, 1 in 8 teens have forwarded an explicit text message, a sex message, without permission. 1 in 8. Now, despite the fact that that's illegal and this is the propagation of child porn and all sorts of other things, right, if they're minors, and you have 1 in 12 teens have had one of their sexts forwarded without permission. And the statistics were showing that girls are just as likely as boys to send or receive these kind of messages. And so we might think, well, again, not my child, it wouldn't happen, right? But if they're around, 27% have received one. And so if someone is accustomed to, well, this is how I'm going to garner attention, then it could easily come right towards your son or daughter. So here's the question. We've come across pornography, we've come across some of these things. So what do you do? You're a parent. What do you do when you discover that your child is viewing inappropriate content online? Right? You find out that they've been looking at porn. You find out that they've been consuming LGBT. You find out that they've been, in the drug subculture. You find out that they've been sexy. You find out what do you do? What do you like? And you need to think about this, because if you think, well, my child's not going to be exposed to this, right? We are fooling ourselves if we think that our child won't be exposed to this worldliness around us. And so we have to decide, okay, how am I going to, I need to prepare for this, right? And that's the first thing. So we need to think and plan beforehand, right? And make sure that we know what we're going to say beforehand. It's likely that our children have kept this a secret. They're certainly not likely to come to you and say, hey, this is the first time and look what I found. They've likely kept it a secret. And so as we need to prepare and think about, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? How am I going to react? Because this is a message that I don't want to hear, but we have to be prepared that, if we don't hear it, it's because they're not telling us and we're not inspecting and we're unaware of the problem. It's not because the problem doesn't exist. If we put our head in the sand and think that none of our children will experience these issues, then we're doing harm to them and we're not doing our job of guiding our children and teaching them. Right? So the first step is to prepare, to think about it, right? Because this is not going to be the last time they mess up. We need to create, as parents, an environment where our children know that we are on their side and we are helping them through this, right? That I'm here to help you through this situation. And this is not going to be the last time that they mess up. And if we handle this, if we blow up, if we erupt, if we throw them out of the house, if we fall apart and melt down and think I'm a complete failure and what's happened, right? That's not conducive. That's not helping them. Right? We have to prepare ourselves. And then we need to know how we're going to respond. Right. So there's a couple different ways. You could respond with it's all right, everybody does it, right? Well, of course, we're not going to say that. But then we'll say, well, I'm going to blow up and I'm really going to give it to them. Well, I can tell you, they're not going to come back to you. If you handle this correctly, when they're faced with another challenge, then they'll come back to you again. However, if you don't handle this appropriately, they're not going to come back to you again. You need to respond with love, but you need to hold them accountable. And as you're holding them accountable, right, you're providing guidance to them. They may know, you may need to explain why this is wrong or why this is poor. They may already know why it's wrong and they did it anyways. Okay, so now I'm going to provide guidance on how do you avoid this in the future? How do you avoid this? and the teen's looking to you for guidance. And so that's an opportunity for you to go, okay, well, when I'm faced with temptations, right? Like, here's how I avoid it. Here's what I do instead. And if we're open and we foster that open communication and we talk with them about these situations, then we can help guide them, which is our job as parents, to guide them through life and help return them back to God. And if we don't talk to them about it, or our reaction immediately is blowing up or falling apart, right? We've done them harm. They won't come to us again. So what will happen is they're going to go off further into this behavior, or they're going to go somewhere else. Like, we have to find it. We have to address it. We have to address it early on. And so there was a question about how do we foster open communication about technology so kids can feel safe to talk with us when they're exposed to inappropriate content. And I would submit to you, it's no different than any other topic, right? We need to talk about whatever these issues are. We need to talk about them openly. We need to talk about them often. And again, like, I keep repeating the same verse, but we need to teach them when we sit in our house, when we walk by the way, when we lie down, when we rise up. Like, we need to talk with them often, because if they're comfortable and they hear from us about subjects of pornography or subjects of, like, if they don't know about sex, well, they're going to want to go look and find out information. And when they go find that, who's going to be their teacher, right? Like, I would submit to you that we need to show them what the Bible says on the matter, and so they know where to find the answers, and they can come to us for counsel, right? Share with them how we deal with situations. Share with them how we deal with inappropriate content when we encounter. Teach them and equip them before they're faced with it, so when they do come across it, they know, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is how I'm to handle this situation. There were several questions that were submitted, and I want to go through a few of them here. And the first one was, in your estimation, what is the number one message our kids are hearing from social media and other online platforms? And the answer to this is worldliness. It's sin. Sin is acceptable. Sin is glorified. And that sin is whatever you're vulnerable to, right? That sin is violence. That sin is racism. That sin is sex. That sin is LGBT. That sin, you fill in the blank, right? You want to know what the number one message they're hearing is? Sin is okay. And sin is acceptable. And it's not even sin. It's just whatever I want. It's my choice, right? That's, in my estimation, that's what it is. The next question was, what is the greatest danger of social media? Now, interesting enough, when I saw this, I thought I was going to have this big, long answer, but this is the shortest answer out of all of them. What is the greatest danger of social media? I would submit to you the greatest danger of social media is losing your child's soul. It doesn't mean that because they may have social media that they're certainly going to lose their soul, but that's the greatest danger of it. If we don't guide them, and if we throw them to the wolves, we will see the devil is seeking whom he may devour. He's like a raging and roaring lion roaming around, and our children are out there. We need to protect them. The next question. Is there a certain age when we should be discussing social media and its dangers with kids or children? And yes, I would say before they start using it, right? If you start discussing social media, if you just start discussing the dangers of social media with children, and you start discussing it after they've been on social media, you've started too late. Now, that's no reason to say, well, it's too late. They've been on for 2 or 3 years. Okay. So those children, they need to be instructed early. Like, it's like driver's education, right? It's not going to be helpful to give driver's education after somebody has already, hey, I've been driving for 10 years and now I know how to follow the laws of the land. Like it's the same thing. If we're going to allow them to use this tool to be exposed to this element of the world, like if our child is going to go with somebody, right? So maybe your child wants to go to Six Flags with some other family, right? And are you going to sit down and have a conversation with them about what thing, if they're young, what things they should do, what things they shouldn't do, where they should, like, you're gonna help because they're going to a situation where maybe it's not, there's not a significant amount of danger, but there's some concern. So that's the same principle here in social media. I would like to turn the question around though. What benefit do you think, as the parent, what benefit do you think your children have in being on social media? What benefit is it to your children to be on social media? Like, is it going to help them get better grades? Are they going to have a better chance at a job? Are they going to build stronger, more lasting friendships because of social media? Are they going to, like, I think the answers are obvious. And I think that we need to ask the question to ourselves, what is our benefit? Right. So there are benefits, there are potential upsides to being on social media. There are also significant dangers to being on social media. And so we need to make sure that we know what those risks, those benefits, and those dangers are. Another question is, what are some age-appropriate guidelines for how much time and how much freedom a child should be given at each age, with the idea that they are transitioning to self-regulation? This is a difficult question to answer because every child is different. This is directly dependent upon the maturity of the child. And with anything in life, right, we should only give our children as much freedom as they can handle. Like, I'm not going to let my toddler go down the street without me being there, but I'm certainly fine with my 17-year-old walking down the street to their friend's house if it's a safe walk, right? So it's the same thing. So as they're transitioning to self-regulation, right? So that transition period, roughly 18 years old, or when they move out, or when they go to college, right? That's when they should be at almost full self-regulation. They should be at full self-regulation. Doesn't mean they are, but they should be at full self-regulation at 18, right? So how many years of social media do you think that they need before self-regulation? Like, I think that if we train to them that they don't need this, and that they certainly are aware of it, they can see it, but it's not until they're much older and more mature and they have established and demonstrated their ability to handle this, then that's when we permit it. That's when we allow that. And that's different for each child. And I think there are levels of types of communication. For instance, we go to, before the pandemic, we were going to Polishing the Pulpit every year. And so my children made friends with kids in their class, and they wanted to maintain contact with them. And so they started out writing, pen pal writing back and forth, but that didn't go real well. I mean, they tried, there were a few letters back and forth, but it wasn't as well. And so we got them on a messenger that we control, that only they can talk with who we want them to talk, and they can't delete any messages. And here they go. Now they can communicate with their friends. So there are some benefits at certain ages, but that's dependent upon each child. The next question is, knowing that this is the world we live in, how can we as a church and as individuals use technology for good? And how can technology be used effectively to reach the lost, and what is ineffective? We have to be intentional. That's the answer, right? We have to be intentional. It will not happen by accident. Because we happen to be on social media doesn't make it a better place. It's what we're posting. So there are a couple people that come to mind. And there was a fellow that he ended up visiting the congregation at Orange Street in Auburndale, and one of our deacons asked him if he wanted to have a Bible study, and he said, sure. And he had previously been attending a couple of different denominations, and he ended up studying and becoming a New Testament Christian. He came out of a really rough life. He came out of drugs and alcohol and crime, and it was, a very, very hard street life. And he did 180 degrees and began posting things about how to get out of that on his Facebook page. And because of that content that he was regularly producing out there, right, it was all of these friends that used to sell and buy and sell drugs from him or with him, and those folks that used to run with him, all of those things, they begin to see this. He's not the same person anymore. And because of that, there was a guy that was one of his friends that used to run with him, who was on difficult times, reached out to him and said, man, I'm having a real hard time, and I see that your life is going great, and he said, go see the folks at Orange Street. And he's like, they won't see me. They won't talk to me. They won't, he's like, yes, they will. Right. Well, that guy was baptized a year ago, and now he's a faithful Christian. He's here. So we absolutely can use technology for good. There's multiple people who I've seen that do, but it has to be intentional. And we're almost out of time. So the last question that we'll cover here is, can't kids just delete their history or hide apps they're using? How can we be sure what they're looking up? So if children are deleting texts, if children are deleting history, if they're hiding apps, if they're hiding behavior, it's because they know what they're doing is wrong, or they know what they're doing is unacceptable. So can't they do it? Yeah, they can. Now, there are some things that you can do to see when that happened, and you can get copies of it beforehand, but that's a very technical conversation, and it's going to be dependent upon what platform you're using and what age child you're dealing with, and how tech savvy you are. So there's a whole combination. So you could spend hours talking about, here's how to secure it for this age group in an Apple environment. Here's how to secure it for this age group in an Android environment. And how tech savvy are you? I would recommend you do these things. So there's a whole host of things you can do. But I would say if your child is deleting something, like that needs to be, you're not deleting. If we also need to remember, we were talking about how do we respond to it, not blow up, not lose our minds when they do something they shouldn't do. It needs to be, we are helping them, guiding them, to making good decisions. Like, why did you do that? Right? Was it tempting to you? Is that why it was? Or did you see something? Like, why did you do that? And then help them make the right decision, and so that they're not trying to hide things from you. Because if you want to play a hiding game, most kids will eventually will find a way to hide it from you. Now, you may be able to find some things out, but if they're hiding things, then you need to make sure that they know that's unacceptable to hide it, period. And you need to work on how you work with them. So it looks like that our time is up. We've reached the end of our allotted time. So don't know that we have any time for questions to be asked tonight, unless there was something pressing that's been passed to Tucker. What I would say is, I wish that I were there in person and could be able to have a little better interaction than sitting here looking through the screen. But if you have some specific questions that you would like addressed and need some help with, this is the last of this class and this session. So but I would be glad you can provide those questions to Tucker or one of the elders, and Scott can get those to me, and I'll be glad to help in whatever way I can as we try to help guide our children through the world of social media and all the pitfalls that exist out there, and help them live in this world, and so that they're in the world, but they're not of the world. So with that, I will dismiss with a prayer, and then we'll head on home. If you would bow with me. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so very much for this day. We thank you for all the many wonderful blessings you've heaped upon us. We thank you for this opportunity we've had to come together, both physically and virtually, to discuss manners of technology and its effect upon our families and upon youth. We ask and we pray that the youth here at university, that they might be strengthened and encouraged by some of the things that they've heard, and that their parents might work together with them, that they might help navigate these difficult roads that are around them. We ask that you bless each and every one of us, grant us the patience and the courage to make the difficult decisions and to help to address issues of sin before they become so ensnaring that a soul is lost. We know there were some that were mentioned at the beginning that were ill and that have passed away, and we ask that you be with those and restore them to their health, and be with that family that lost their loved one, that and that we might be a comfort to them. Lord, we ask your blessing upon us and upon our families, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.